Hey, 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 Cedarbrook, how are you doing? My name is James Brown. I'm one of the pastors in this place. And if you are new with us today, I just want to welcome you. So glad that you are here. You have tuned in for a great weekend service. This Sunday, we are starting a brand new teaching series that I'm excited about. We're going to be in it all December, and it is called The Thrill of Hope. And if there is one thing for which I need significant hope in my life, it is the inevitable battle that begins near the beginning of every November, every single year. One of the biggest points of contention, disagreement my wife and I have annually is when do we start celebrating Christmas. Specifically, what I mean by that is when do we put up the tree and when do we put up all the decor and all the ornamentation that goes with this holiday. Now, personally, my opinion is, and I'm pretty sure this is somewhere in the Bible, my opinion is that there should be no, and I repeat, no Christmas decorations. There should be no Christmas music. There should be no Christmas caroling or songs, no Christmas movies until the day after Turkey Day, the day after Thanksgiving. Anybody else, as you're watching, anybody else agree with me that after Thanksgiving you can start thinking about Christmas? Go ahead and raise your hand if you're in your living room or if you're in a coffee shop. It doesn't matter. Just put your hand in the air like you just don't care. Yeah, good. Now, anybody on the other side of the argument that November is a perfectly fine time to start putting up Christmas decorations? Anybody? Yeah, raise your hand. Yeah, I will pray for your souls, because that is not okay. Yeah, again, in my opinion, it is, and I'm sure, again, this is in the Bible somewhere, Thanksgiving is an important enough holiday that we need to give it the respect that it is due. I think a few minutes of gratitude is good for the soul. Now, I say that, and don't get me wrong here, because within its proper parameters, within its proper place, I love me some Christmas. I love Christmas, especially Christmas movies. And in fact, I have put together my top 3 Christmas movies that I love to watch every single year. And I'll just run them through with you. If you want to play along or guess, that's fine with me. My number 3 favorite Christmas movie is called Die Hard. Die Hard. Now, there's a lot of controversy around whether or not that's actually a Christmas movie. But I believe it is, and it's number 3 on my list. Number 2 on my list is Christmas Vacation. Christmas Vacation. I love this one as well, with the lights and the complexity of family relationships. Love it, love it, love it. And my number 1, without question, is the beautiful masterpiece called Elf. Elf. Anybody else have that one as their number 1? Yeah. It's a great, great movie. Now, there's one more that I want to include in this list, and I'll call this my honorable mention, which is the Charlie Brown Christmas special. I love this one as well. And I wanted to include this in my favorites list because I think that the Linus quoting the Christmas story from the Bible is one of my favorite scenes during the Christmas season. And most people, as they think about Christmas, they like to start there. They like to start where Linus started his story, his reciting. He wanted to start right there in Luke 2 with the unexpected birth of little baby Jesus, but the Christmas story actually begins a chapter earlier in Luke 1 with the birth of another unexpected child named John. So I want to share his story with you today. So if you have a Bible with you, or if you have a Bible app, I want to encourage you to go ahead and turn to Luke chapter 1. Luke chapter 1. Now, I want to start here in this part of the Christmas story because, believe it or not, the world into which Jesus was born, I think, mirrors our world right now in many different ways. Actually, just like we experienced in 2020, the original Christmas context was also characterized by intense unpredictability and upheaval. For example, author Philip Yancey describes the first century situation this way. Speaking of Christmas cards, he writes this. He says, Christmas cards stress sunny words like love and goodwill and cheer, happiness and warmth. It is a fine thing, I suppose, that we honor a sacred holiday with such homey sentiments. And yet, when I turn to the gospel accounts of the first Christmas, I hear a very different tone and sense mainly, look at this, disruption at work. Disruption at work. Which is exactly what we see as Luke kicks off this Christmas story in verse 5. So if you want to follow along, Luke chapter 1, verse 5 reads like this. It says, when Herod was king of Judah. When Herod was king of Judah. Now, we're only just a couple words into this story so far, but this is important info for us to understand what is happening and what is going on in this place at this time. Herod, that's mentioned in this verse, he was known as a puppet king in Rome while the empire was aggressively trying to take over the known world at that time. They had already dominated Israel, and they were taking Israel land, and they were taxing them into poverty. They had already done so many damaging things to the country, and in exchange for running this scheme in Israel, Herod was generously compensated by the emperor. So Herod spent most of his time not overseeing the Israelites, but rather managing and overseeing his various construction projects for his palaces. Now, in addition to that, history tells us that Herod was also a complete and utter psychopath. He was a lunatic, and he had no regard for human life. We know that he had 2 brothers-in-law and his wife and his 2 sons. He had them murdered because he didn't trust them. Also, 5 days before Herod knew he was about to die, he rounded up and arrested some of the more well-known citizens, the respected citizens of that community, and commanded that they would be executed on the very day that he died. And he did that so that there would be this attitude of sadness at the same time of his death. He wanted that to happen, and so he made it happen. So it shouldn't surprise us that Herod was also the guy that we see in another part of the Christmas story, who after he hears about Jesus from the wise men, he has all the infant boys around and in Bethlehem murdered. This was this guy. He was a pretty sick individual. But this that I'm describing is the immediate context for the Christmas story that we celebrate every single year. This that I'm describing is the world into which Jesus was born. And so for the Jewish people, Herod represented the rock bottom of their history. For 400 years now, the people of Israel had been praying for a deliverer, had been praying for a Messiah, for a promised king. And now they were stuck with this brutal imposter. And it felt like that God was not listening to their prayers anymore. It felt like that. Or at the very least, that God did not care about them. And yet, at the very same time, we see some people who were still hanging on to their hope. And we see it in verse 5. Look at it again with me if you would. Verse 5 says, when Herod was king of Judea, there was a Jewish priest named Zechariah. He was a member of the priestly order of Abijah, and his wife Elizabeth was also from the priestly line of Aaron. Verse 6, and here's the deal. Zechariah and Elizabeth were righteous in God's eyes, careful to obey all the Lord's commandments and regulations. What essentially Luke is writing here is describing Zechariah and Elizabeth as observant Jews, that they were committed to the cause that God had initiated with the nation of Israel, that they were committed. And what's fascinating is that their names also indicate that as well. Here's what you need to know about these two. The name, the ancient Hebrew name Zechariah in Hebrew means faithful. And his wife, Elizabeth, in Hebrew means covenant or promise. So if you put their names together, what you have is this couple who represents the faithful promise that God had given to the nation of Israel, which is significant because of what we find out about them next in verse 7. Look at it with me. It said they had, Elizabeth and Zechariah, they had no children because Elizabeth was unable to conceive. and they were both very old. Now, there's a lot that is in this verse that we just read. I mean, here you have Zach and Beth who have no kids. Plus, now at their age, biologically, it looks like they have no hope of having any kids ever in their life. All that hope had essentially disappears. And what complicates things is even though it looks like on the surface they're doing all the right things, they're living in this culture where childlessness is assumed to be the direct result of divine punishment or spiritual defectiveness. So there's a stigma about their situation. And I can only imagine in my mind Elizabeth walking around her house at night wondering what she did wrong or why God hasn't answered her prayer for a child. I can only imagine that the numerous, endless, sleepless nights walking and wandering around the house, shouting and begging and pleading and arguing with God, asking, why, God, why won't you answer this prayer? I imagine her doing that, but I also imagine that at this point in their life, she's probably given up hope and abandoned this discussion with God altogether. And I read their story, and I think there's a lot of us who might find ourselves in that situation as well. There's a lot of you who might be in the same place as Elizabeth as well. And sadly, this season called Christmas tends to bring these kind of emotions out in all of us, right? This time of the year is completely oriented around kids. And it's compounded by the fact that the Christmas story is about a baby being born. And maybe like these two, you are struggling with infertility. And going shopping or going to the mall is tough for you. It's a tough thing to do. Going to Christmas parties or Christmas gatherings or seeing Christmas shows on television it's difficult for you. And perhaps the most painful part of this whole Christmas season is coming to church as we talk about and orient our lives around a child being born. And I just want to acknowledge that it is difficult for some. And if that's you, I want you to know that we see you. And we love you, and we're glad that you are part of us. And we want to serve you. And if you have given up hope, as you are seeking answers, you're finding your faith, know that we are praying for you. Because this kind of struggle is a difficult one for all of us. And it has a unique kind of pain, I think, specifically for those that are in ministry, for those who work for God, for pastors, for priests like Zechariah. I mean, it would have been especially easy for him to just give up on God because he worked for God, but God was not answering his prayer. Zechariah could have given up, but he didn't give up. Instead, he and Elizabeth live up to their names. They live into their names of faithful promise, faithful both to God and to one another, which is exactly why we see Zechariah going back to work, back to the temple. Look at verse 8. It says, one day Zechariah was serving God in the temple, for his order was on duty that week. Verse 9, as the custom of the priest, he was chosen by lot to enter the sanctuary of the Lord and burn incense. Look at verse 10. While the incense was being burned, a great crowd stood outside praying. While Zechariah was in the sanctuary, an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing to the right of the incense altar. In verse 12, Zechariah was shaken and overwhelmed with fear when he saw him. Now, this is where the story gets exciting because this is where the story begins to go off the rails. I think our perspective about what is happening here in this moment with Zechariah and the angel is often shaped more by Hallmark cards than by what is actually taking place in the pages of the Bible. Because in paintings and pictures and Christmas cards, angels are often represented as soft, non-threatening, unintimidating little children. No offense, kids. They often look like these guys, or maybe these other guys, these little girls praying, or the little guys that are bored. And the bottom line is, neither of them are very scary. Neither of these would overwhelm you with fear. And so as I think about the way that the Bible talks about the reaction that we have to angels, I see people's responses to angels looking more like this.
Matt, our husband, why are you in your clothes? Where's Dad? Hey.
I love that video. In fact, that's just a few seconds of a larger video of a guy scaring his wife over the course of 6 years. I mean, that's commitment from your husband, right? I love that clip because as I read through the pages of the Bible, when people encounter angels, they don't find little bored children or with their hands folded across, in prayer. What you see is people freaking out. But what you see is people falling down because they're terrified. And I think this terror is why the angel responds the way that it does in verse 13. Look at it. But the angel said, don't be afraid, Zechariah. God has heard your prayer. Which is great, right? This is fantastic. But the question is, which prayer? Which prayer? The one that I just prayed here in the temple, the prayer for the Messiah to come and give us relief from the oppression of the Roman government, that prayer? Angel says, nope, not that one, a different one, the prayer that you've prayed over and over again, the prayer that you've prayed with a broken heart and a tearful eye for a long, long time. That prayer, it says, that your wife, Elizabeth, will give birth to a son, and by the way, you are to name him John. And to Zechariah, this news is incredible. It is unbelievable. I mean, he and Elizabeth have had enough heartbreak for a lifetime. So just to make sure that the angel is saying something that is true in verse 18, he just reaffirms it. Zechariah said to the angel, how can I be sure this will happen? How do I know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that you are telling the truth? Because if this is a joke, it would be a sick one. It isn't going to be funny. How can I be sure that this promise is for real? How can I be sure that you will be faithful? Because, and here comes the biological lesson, I know you're an angel and all, and you're spiritual about all heavenly things, but I'm not sure you're aware of how things work here down on the earth. Or maybe you haven't noticed that he says, I'm an old man now, and my wife is well along in years. Translated simply means, Mr. Angel, me and Betty are old, and old people don't have babies. Now, his honesty is amazing, and knowing that Zechariah is a priest, I know that he knows that God can do this thing that the angel just said would happen. I know Zechariah knows that because the whole nation of Israel began with Abraham and Sarah having a son, Isaac, when they were almost a century old. Zach believes God can do it. He just doesn't believe that God would do it for him. which I think, by the way, is why the angel had to remind him of his prayer, because it had probably been a while since he actually prayed it. I mean, he had gotten used to the idea that God could do impossible things for other people, but God would never do anything like that for him. So he stopped asking God for it. Can you relate to Zechariah here? I mean, in fact, if you allow me just to ask you a question today, I would love to. It's kind of a deeply personal question, but like Zechariah, what have you stopped praying for? But what is it that you used to ask God for, but no more? I mean, maybe you used to pray, God, I want him to stop drinking. Can you make that happen? Can you do that miracle? Maybe you used to pray, God, I want to be faithful. I want to follow through. I want my word to matter. Maybe you used to pray, God, would you bring my kid back into the family? The prodigal son, the prodigal daughter who've made choices that have separated them from the rest of the people that love them. Can you just bring them back? Would you do that miracle for me? God, would you make this depression subside? Would you make this temptation go away? Or God, would you fill in the blank, whatever that is for you? I mean, you used to ask God, but you've given up on praying because you've given up hope that it will ever happen for you, and not wanting to get your hopes up. Just like Zechariah didn't want to get his hopes up, you start focusing on the how of the situation. How can I be sure that this will happen? How can I be sure that what you say is true? I mean, we're too old and he will never change, or that's just the way she is, or I'm too broken, or I'm too weak, or I'm not worth it. The how is what we tend to focus on, because if we're honest, we don't think God is really listening to us, or that he even cares about our predicament. I mean, after all, who am I to presume that God, the God of the universe, even cares enough about me asking about these piddly little things? Or these prayers that I pray over and over and over again, the same prayer time and time again. Who am I to think that the creator of the universe would care when he has so many other things going on? But Cedarbrook, here's the deal. Here is where we find our thrill of hope this Christmas season. And we find it when we ask not how, but who. The thrill of this season, the thrill of this story, where we find our hope is not in the how it's going to happen, but in the who is going to make it happen. And God reminds Zechariah of the who. Look at verse 19. It says, then the angel said, I am Gabriel. I am Gabriel. Clearly, the angel is offended here. Gabe's like, bro. I get that this whole encounter's a little weird for you, but pull it together, man. Yeah, you've been in the Holy of Holies here lighting candles and burning incense, and I get it. That's an important gig for you, but do you know who you're talking to? Gabriel says, I am Gabriel. And here's what he says about himself. I stand in the very presence of God. I stand in the presence of the Almighty Creator and Maker of everything. As far as the universe goes, Gabriel says, I'm kind of a big deal here. And I've been dispatched to tell you something important, something that you need to know, something that you need to hear. And here is what Gabriel says. Here it is, Cedarbrook. And this is so important. Don't miss this. Gabriel says, it was he who sent me to bring you this what? Good news. It was he. It was who? He who sent me to bring you this good news. This good news. This good news. This good news, right? This good news. I was sent to tell you this good news. What good news was Gabriel sent to tell? That Zach and Beth are having a baby? Yeah. That's part of it, but that's not the whole good news. That's not it all the way. There was some other good news that Gabe brought as well. What was it? Well, look back at verse 13. It came right before the baby announcement. Verse 13 says this. I want you to see this. Look at these words with me. But the angel said, I love this so much. He said, don't be afraid, Zechariah. Look at this, look at this. God has what? God has heard your prayer. The good news, Zechariah, is that God hears you. The good news for you is that God hears you. Friends, Christmas is the announcement that in the midst of your fears, in the midst of your pain, in the midst of your hurt and hopelessness and doubt, the good news is that God hears you. Christmas is the announcement that God hears you. He hears our big prayers, and He hears our small prayers, and He hears everything we say in between. Cedarbrook, Christmas is the announcement that God hears you. And hear this, He even hears the prayers you have stopped praying. So let me ask you again, what have you stopped praying for? Because maybe the holiday truth that you need to hear to overcome your discouragement and disappointment and fears for the new year, the holiday truth that you need to hear is that God hears you. And I want to say to you, believe it and live it. And allow it to give you some Christmas courage so that you can experience the thrill of hope this season.